And now we return to our main story tonight. Can Ukraine join the EU in a limited capacity in 2027? Joining me now to discuss is Fabrice Pothier, CEO of Rasmussen Global. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us. Yes,
nice to see you.
Yes, great to see you as well. Thanks for joining us on TVP World. Now, Brussels is preparing to include Ukraine in the European community as part of a future peace agreement. What specific rights and obligations would Ukraine gain, maybe not gain, under this proposed membership light or reverse enlargement?
Well, I don't know the exact details because they're actually being negotiated as we are speaking. But I'm also understand that this is a bit what NATO does with what NATO did actually with Finland and Sweden when they were not yet full-fledged members of the alliance. But for some years, especially in the case of Sweden, whose membership was held by Turkey, was still sitting at the table, at the NAC table, was taking part in deliberation, but was not, in a way, voting. So I could imagine that member states are thinking of reproducing the same in the EU context. Why? Because there's this sense of urgency that Ukraine needs to be anchored in the broader European family, and that if there is indeed a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia, where Ukraine has to make some really hard compromises, especially territorial ones, that at least there is this guarantee of Ukraine becoming a member of the European Union.
Right. Now, would this be possible for partial EU membership to be legally structured within the existing EU treaties?
It's a good question. I think, the EU can be creative when it wants and when it has the political will to be creative. And if you look at how the treaties have been applied, the exemptions on some opt-outs on certain parts of the treaty by some members, like previously, for example, Denmark, for the European political security and defense policy. So I think there are ways to find exceptions and work around the treaties. But I think what this tells us is we're entering a new era for the EU, where it needs to think itself more in terms of flexible geometry, new groupings, new coalitions, than instead of having something very rigid where it's all about the 27 and nothing else.
Right. Well, what about the states that have been seeking enlargement, like including the West Balkans? What about them? Is that fair for them to have, Ukraine kind of leapfrog the process just because of the situation it's in?
Well, quite frankly, and this is more the kind of realpolitik argument, I think some aspirants are more equal than others because some have a geopolitical and economic value than other EU aspirants, like in the Western Balkans, do not have to the same extent. That doesn't mean they don't have, value in their own merit, but it does mean that Ukraine holds a very, very peculiar strategic value. It is, in a way, the front line and the eastern flank of the European Union vis-à-vis Russia. It is also potentially a big agriculture and industrial power. And the EU now needs to have as much, I would say, strategic depth as it can, facing the Chinas, Russias, and increasingly the United States.
Well, how would partial EU membership be legally structured? Oh, excuse me. I'd like to refer to Hungary right now. The concrete mechanisms that the EU could use to bypass, say, Hungary if it objects and if Viktor Orban continues to rule the country.
Yeah, that's an important question. And I think there are talks, but I'm not sure how serious they are, of invoking Article 7, which will essentially mean excluding Ukraine from the European Union. But that will require, obviously, the 26 agreeing on that. And at the last time when there was talk of triggering Article 7, there was not such majority or unanimity. Second, you could have the kind of Viktor Orban going to the toilet way of addressing the issue, which was the case with the loans agreed for Ukraine, the 90 billion euro loan. But I do think that for a matter that is so fundamental as welcoming a new member of the European Union, you will have to have something more drastic. So all hopes are on the change of government in Budapest during the April elections. And if not, I think we'll have to see what's the political will among the 26.
How would EU citizens and national parliaments in member states be persuaded to accept a multi-speed or multi-tiered process here? Would that not trigger some kind of political backlash?
I don't think this is what triggers political backlash, quite frankly. I think it's more the high-speed European Union imposing too many regulations on national or local constituencies. So I think the multi-speed might address some issues where I do remember talking before the European elections, talking to French voters on the ground. And their main concern was, how is it possible that a country like Hungary can receive so many EU funds, structural funds, and yet refuse to go alongside some EU policies that are important for all the rest? So I think the multi-speed might address some of these concerns.
What if there isn't a peace agreement before then? If, let's say, the war continues, would this still be potentially open? I know we're at the very beginning stages, but would that prevent accession, or is there some kind of fallback plan?
I don't think the EU and the European countries right now are very good at fallback plans or plan B, because as we can see, for example, they know the US is slowly withdrawing from Europe, and yet we don't really have a credible plan B when it comes to European security and defense. So I don't think there's a plan B. I think there is an attempt to be creative and address a very difficult dilemma that is going to be faced by President Zelensky, as to accept some really hard territorial compromises with US guarantees that might not be as strong as they are expected, and therefore the EU will have to step up.
I agree. But on the whole, I guess to kind of sum up here, do you think that this proposal, this idea, is more of a pipe dream, or do you think that the officials within the Commission in Brussels can actually get Europeans to and member states to really consider this option as a way to, show their solidarity with Ukraine and push the security of the continent ultimately, because that's what we're talking about, forward?
I think the fact that one of the most articulate European statesman, Mario Draghi, has recently called for more or less the same idea of, we should be more pragmatic, we should be more concentric in welcoming those who are willing to go further. I think this shows that it's out there, because Europe needs to, in a way, reinvent itself. We cannot just stick to the stricture of the EU treaties and see the whole world around us unraveling. So I think this is a philosophical shift. Whether it translates politically in the coming month, I doubt, because Europe usually has issues finding the kind of sense of urgency. But I think this is the trajectory we're taking. And you could expect that in the coming years, Europe will have a fairly different geometry and ideas now.
Yes, times are changing, and it's definitely time to think outside the box. Fabrice Pothier, CEO of Rasmussen Global, thank you so much for joining us. Very much appreciated. Thank you. And that's all the time we have on this edition of World News Tonight. Thanks for joining us. Have a great evening, and we'll see you next time. Good night.